Good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Sharman. I'm the head of Department of Politics and International Studies. Welcome to the webinar for tonight. Are we at the end of a long 20th century? It's jointly hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics and the Department for Politics and International Studies. And so a particularly welcome both to friends of the Centre and friends and alumni of the department as well. My job as chair is to do three things. First off, briefly do some digital housekeeping, and secondly, to introduce our three POLIS panelists for this evening. And finally, in the second half of the event, to moderate questions. I'll start off with a digital housekeeping. Again, those of you who have been at webinars for the Centre for Geopolitics before will find this familiar. So obviously, this is an online video panel. I will moderate the discussion with the panelists. The panelists have got about 10 minutes each to speak, and then we switch over to your questions. Obviously, as the audience, you will be able to see and hear the panelists, but we will not be able to, your microphone and cameras are switched off at the moment. Please, when you're asking questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Click on it and you can see that there's a dialog box when you type in. When and if you put in your question, we do ask if you could start with your name and affiliation. And if the question is directed at a particular speaker, if you could just list that as well. We've got a lot of people signed up for tonight's event, just shy of 300. So we'll try to get through as many questions as we can, but my apologies in advance if we do run out of time there. Finally, in terms of the housekeeping part, importantly, I do want to let you know that this session is being recorded and that the recording will be posted on the website for the Centre for Geopolitics. I'll now just quickly introduce the three speakers in order for they'll speak. So the first is Aisha Zarakol, who's a reader in international relations at POLIS and also a fellow at Emmanuel College. Dr. Zarakol works on the evolution of East and West relations in the international order, declining and rising powers, and the politics of non-Western regional powers. She's the author of After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West, and the the editor of Hierarchies in World Politics, and she's currently finishing a book forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, Before Defeat, Rethinking Decline. Our second speaker for tonight is Professor Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy and POLIS, and a fellow at Clare College. She's a regular panelist on Talking Politics, and Professor Thompson's work is focused on the historical origins of the post-2008 political world and its generation and the crises it's generating for Western countries. And more particularly, her recent work covers the political economy of oil, Brexit, and the Eurozone crisis. The third speaker for tonight, Kanchin Lin, is a lecturer in POLIS and also the Tan Sufyan College lecturer and fellow at Gonville and Keys. He's the acting director of the Centre for Geopolitics, and his recent research focuses on the politics of transport infrastructure and energy markets in China, and the economic and security nexus in maritime governance in the Indo-Pacific. With that, I'll now turn over to our panelists, starting with Aisha Zarakol.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, the Center for Geopolitics, for inviting me on this panel. The question that we're posed is whether we're at the end of the long 20th century, and I would like to take the time I'm given to think through this question. And I would like to note two things at the outset that I think may be helpful in answering this question, two things that I think are simultaneously true. First is, if we define international orders as packages of structural, institutional, and normative elements, I think it is true that such elements change in ways that are recognizable in hindsight, given within certain intervals. And those intervals often correspond to an average lifespan of about a century, give or take. I mean, I don't mean this in a deterministic way, in that all international orders must last about a century. But as Jason mentioned, I'm finishing a book on re-theorizing decline that rests on a historical analysis extending back to the 13th century and looks mostly outside of Europe for its examples, and even broadening the case, universe of cases in such a way. I did not find many international or regional orders that lasted longer than a century. So I think the temptation is there, even though the century lifespan of a given order does not necessarily correspond to the calendar century. I think the temptation is there to make it stretch in either way, so that it corresponds to a calendar century. And that brings me to my second point, which is that as humans, we are interested in imposing order onto history and finding patterns in the messiness of human behavior. So we like to pick certain landmark dates to punctuate these periods of change and make it seem like there are clean breaks between them. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the change is real, but gradual, and it's recognizable in hindsight. But while we're living through the change, we're still looking for ways to make sense of it. So we're looking for landmark dates. So the way we date the ends of periods is somewhat arbitrary. For instance, one could argue about whether the 19th century ended with World War I, or even with World War II, or with the decolonizing movements. And those who, I think, look at our period from the future will be arguing about whether the 20th century ended when the Cold War did, or with 9/11, or with the 2007-8 financial crisis, or the Trump COVID era, or some other crisis that hasn't happened yet. And whether they consider the 20th century long or short will depend on when they think the 20th century began, which again is somewhat debatable. So all of this is to say that sooner or later the 20th century will end. That is inevitable, or maybe it already has. And how that is dated will depend on future generations. For us, I think the more interesting question is what exactly we're leaving behind when we leave behind the 20th century. Most people these days call the 20th century an American century, invoking Henry Luce's famous turn of phrase from more than half a century ago. But I myself would like to resist this. I don't think it was an American century only. I'm a bit troubled by how the post-Cold War US triumphalism has induced in us an almost collective amnesia about everything that happened before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I don't mean that only in the sense that the Cold War has been forgotten or downplayed, and I think that is also true, but in that in forgetting about the Soviet Union and the role that it played in the 20th century, we forget what really characterized what we're leaving behind. So I would say the dominant ethos of the 20th century, beyond Americanism or all that, was the belief in modernity, and that modernization theory was the religion of the 20th century, whether it was served under the American, Soviet, or European, or any other flavors. World politics, institutions, and really everything else was organized around beliefs of linear progress to modernity. The modern nation state itself was essentially designed around these notions. The Soviet sphere was very much a reproducer of these beliefs, even as they seem to contest the right way of getting there. Decolonizing nationalists in the third world believed in this end mission. You get my point. So in the high point of the 20th century, almost everyone, regardless of their political leanings, believed in that and in modernity. And this belief instilled in everybody a faith in state and human agency and the possibility of progress. And of course, all of this also led everyone to perceive the West as the center of the world, because the West had reached or nearly reached this pinnacle, this end of history, before everyone else. To the extent that these notions of linear progress and modernity have been eroding and being undermined, one could say that the 20th century has been gradually ending since the 1970s. But the worldview got a new life in the 1980s, and the collapse of the Soviet Union even led to the triumphalism of the liberal version of the end of history modernization thesis. But that was an illusion, as now we know. Belief systems are always more sustainable when they seem to offer two seemingly competing alternatives, which essentially reinforce each other. So the seeds of the erosion of the belief in Western liberal modernity were present in the defeat of its Soviet version. And in the intervening decades, it has been one crisis after another, eroding the world's belief in progress, in modernity, and the specialness of the West. So I think this is the 20th century that we are leaving behind or have already left behind. What is next? I'm not so sure. The easy answer is to say it will be the Chinese century. And I think maybe Casey and Helen will talk more about that. But I'm not entirely convinced for two reasons. First, I think it is rare that world orders or international orders are made by single actors or countries, that for reasons I have explained just now, and I don't see enough around China to launch an alternative yet. And the second reason is that I see China as it currently is and functions as very much a product of the 20th century, a 20th century nation state. So for that reason, I don't yet see an alternative there, but maybe it will come. So in conclusion, you know, what rough beast, it's our calm round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I would say we haven't seen it yet. It's all up in the air. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Helen Thompson. Helen, thank you.
Okay, I think actually what I've got to say is actually quite complementary to what Aisha's already said. So I'm going to take as the starting place a version of the topic that Professor Brendan Sims threw at us as a question, which was, if the long 20th century was an American century, what comes next? And I'm also going to be, from a slightly different perspective, rather skeptical of the idea that the 20th century is best characterized as an American century in terms of geopolitics. And there's obviously lots of different things that can be said about this, some of which Aisha's already said, but I'd like to sort of pick up two time periods, the interwar years and the 1970s, and suggest that both of these really complicate the idea that this was an American century in any consistent fashion. So if we take, you know, like the interwar years, what we see is that in the part of the world that is becoming the most geopolitically significant, the Middle East, in terms of a place to be fought over in some sense, the Americans are near entirely absent. So what we see is actually an expansion of British and French imperial power into the Middle East during the interwar years. If we look at it in terms of this idea that America was supposed to be responsible for the peace in Europe, I mean, I don't quite buy that, but if that's the frame we're going into, that turned out to be disastrous. The Americans did not have the power to do that, and they in good part didn't have the power to do that because of the really dysfunctional way in which their democratic politics interacted with foreign policy questions in Eurasia. If we look at it in terms of the challenges that were posed to American power during the interwar years, what we can see is a succession of states, you know, in the end, including states that would go to war with each other, that all tried to escape energy dependence on the United States in the interwar years. And the case of Germany and Japan with pretty destructive consequences. So it takes the Second World War to turn the United States into the power that I think then gets characterized as the dominant power. And even then, it's had to make this compromise during the war with the Soviet Union. It's in Cold War dynamics with the Soviet Union for the next 4 decades. Now that gets us to the 1970s, which seems to me another really big problem with the idea that this is a straightforward American century. First of all, we've got the Americans humiliated in Vietnam. If we look at it in terms of oil power, which has been central to American power for the previous 3 decades, this is the decade which by the middle of it, that the Soviet Union is actually the most significant energy power in the world and not the United States. The United States is becoming an oil independent importer in that decade. That thrusts it into really dysfunctional relationships in the Middle East, not only with Saudi Arabia, but with Iran too. And then by the end of that decade, the Iran pivot has gone and they're left with this complicated Saudi relationship and a permanent Iran problem, i.e. a problem in the Persian Gulf thereafter. If we look at it in terms of the Soviet Union, obviously, by the time we get to the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union is going to be losing its empire in Eastern Europe and on the verge of losing its entire territorial configuration as the Soviet Union. But in that decade, when it became the most powerful energy state in the world, it was constructing an energy relationship with Central Europe centered around Germany that survived through the Cold War, survived the end of the Cold War, and is now there in place today, and which the German government shows no indication of being willing to give up, because it's what the Americans and not just President Trump wants to happen. So we have a lasting legacy, both of American weakness in relationship to energy around Central Europe and Germany in particular, that comes from the 1970s, and in relationship to the Middle East. Those weaknesses are still here in the 21st century. Having said that, as Aisha says, is if the implication is then that the 21st century is going to be China's century, then I think we run into difficulties here too pretty quickly. And we already need, I think, junctures as to something that has fundamentally changed, particularly in relation to American power, and I would say in relation to the relationship between American power and Chinese power. And as Aisha said, you can either put that juncture in like 2007, 2008, around the financial crash. And the case of putting it there is that did, in its consequence and in its fallout, it injected American financial power. It made it much stronger than it had been previously. In particular because of the fact that the Federal Reserve Board now gets to act as a lender of last resort on a selective basis to the rest of the world. And at least since 2011, the more that China has got exposed in Eurodollar markets, then that has complicated deeply the relationship on the financial side between the US and China, such that whilst we can say before 2008 that the United States was that China was acting as a creditor to the United States, now we've got the dynamic in relation to China's corporations, China's banks, where in principle the Fed could be acting as a lender of last resort to the Chinese, and indirectly a mechanism for that happening was put in place at the beginning of the pandemic. The other thing that's changed though, and this is, I think, produced dramatic consequences everywhere, is that the United States, since about 2011, 2012, has gone back to being a significant energy power because of shale oil and shale gas. And that has changed things in Europe. It's made it possible for American presidents to think that they can confront the Germans about the Russia energy relationship. It's changed things in the Middle East. It was the basis on which Obama thought that the United States could pivot out of the Middle East and pivot to East Asia in a different kind of policy towards China. It's the basis on which, since 2016, that the people in Washington have thought it's been possible for the United States essentially to withdraw in the Middle East to the Persian Gulf. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the things that China has done in the last decade are not of consequence in relation to China's long-term power prospects, but I still think they have to be understood in a context in which actually the United States now has more power than it did in the latter part of the Cold War, certainly than it did after 9/11, between 9/11 and 2000 and the 2000 crash. So although we can talk about declining land military power of the United States in the Middle East, it's a lot more difficult to talk about declining American power anywhere else. Indeed, what we're seeing in some ways is the ascendancy of American power where finance and energy is concerned. And so I'm not trying to suggest that this means that the 21st century is going to be a more clearly American century than the 20th is. That will be far too early a generalization to make now. But I am trying to suggest that the next 10 or 20 years, at least, are still going to be shaped primarily by American power rather than anything else.
Great, thanks very much for that, Helen. I'll hand over to our third speaker, KC, in just a second, but also a reminder for people interested in asking questions, it's the fourth icon along, the Q&A function, and please do remember to state your name, affiliation, and the person to whom the question is directed. With that, KC, thanks, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jason. So at the start of the 20th century, we have the United States that was reluctant to take over global leadership, at least according to the mainstream narrative. At the start of the 21st century, we have a China that's eager to do so. The second decade of the last century, we saw massive economic shocks, and America came out of that stronger than ever and more globally engaged. And as Aisha has mentioned, we don't really know what's going to happen to China, with the end of this pandemic shock. So what I would like to talk to you, maybe just suggest to you, is what in political science we call critical junction possibilism, which is to understand, what is changing and what might come out as in terms of state responses, focusing on middle powers and how they respond to great powers. And we remember from World War I and II that middle powers were far from inconsequential. And we tend to forget that when we talk about G2, great power US China today. So there's a lot of things that the COVID-19 pandemic provides a lens toward the pre-existing conditions of China's lack of fit with the Western liberal order. At the same time, it also provides an opportunity, I think, for a lot of countries to reset this very order to be more consistent with their long-term national interests, in particular in addressing these deep problems of globalization and the rise of China, which are the two major drivers of instability in the global system in the past 100 years. So, that comes down to the notion of decoupling, right? So some of us might remember that term was first used in 2008 and 2009 to describe the financial shocks, prematurely in retrospect. At this time, we're talking about the US-PRC bilateral relations as the heart of the future of the international system. And we know that since the late 1990s, the US-China relations, the power transition so-called, has been critical in shaping issues in global affairs, all across the whole range, from economic development, conflict and peacekeeping to international law. So, we're at the situation where, for us as middle powers in the West, and sort of not the global South, but the Western sort of realm, we've had a fairly mix of legacy on shaping global order. We remember from sustainable development, the Millennium Debt Relief Initiative of Tony Blair that allowed the IMF and the World Bank to progressively cut back critical funding for infrastructure in developing countries, and thus create opportunity for China to step in. Meanwhile, we haven't been organized in pushing forward the WTO negotiations or even climate change negotiations. Of course, we have our problems to deal with. We have structural problems. We have redistributive legacies of this financial crisis that we never solved from 2008. And we find ourselves over time in a situation where we're more exposed to Chinese economic influences and disruptions than ever before. And these inequalities, domestic inequalities and interstate inequalities, seem to be direct results of the very nature of globalization, right, which has been sustained by a declining but still powerful Western-centric liberal order, and the generally cooperative bilateral relationship between US and PRC since the late 1990s. So as long as China professed to support the Western order, it had nearly full access to Western markets and political systems, as we're learning. And these inequalities produce elites and stakeholders that continue to defend the status quo, as Professor Niall Ferguson has coined the term chimerica for this sort of dysfunctional codependent relationship. So I think what the pandemic shows us is that these sort of problems of inequality are going to be exacerbated for the long run, as we see the Americans, well, in the short run, but also possibly for longer run, as we see Americans and Chinese closing off borders to reduce hurt. Both superpowers are retrenching with economic protectionism and techno-nationalism. And with staggeringly mounting losses on both sides, become politically feasible for their leaders to seek greater sacrifices from their own populations. We don't have time to get into the details of this. You probably know a lot about what's happening in America, but with China, we have the leader Xi Jinping proposing this so-called dual circulation economic strategy, which basically digs deeper into domestic industrial consumer bases and braces for sort of wartime mobilization effort against any kind of retaliation from US and elsewhere. And that tends to have a very strong lock-in effect on hawkish foreign policies, and which is, in general, it's not going to work very well for everyone. So then the question is, what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, the zero-sum game between US and China means that there's a very narrow margin for the so-called win-win game for the rest of us. So there's, in a very short run, there's some evidence of trade diversion for our benefits in the short run. Last 2 quarters, there's greater share of Chinese exports have gone to the EU and to ASEAN and to the United States. But then things are not looking good in the long run. In investment, the Chinese ODI funding, which we've been too accustomed to, will decline. Following from, if you look at prior trends of the peaking of Chinese ODIs to EU and Europe, it's been going down since 2017. There's an excellent report from the German think tank Merix. I'll encourage you to look at that. And there are other issues for the global South, with countries seeking to renegotiate debt obligation to Beijing. China will have a hard time fundraising in the global market, as well as in giving the damage to the to Hong Kong markets from the recent crackdown. That's not going to help the matter. And the US will be very selective in its aid and development fundings, following its disengagement from international organizations. So that you can imagine the cascading effects that how this will be. So what does this mean for middle powers? Well, if you look at Putin in Russia, he's declared 2020 the year of Sino-Russian scientific technological innovation cooperations. Chinese mobile phones no longer have American chips, they have Russian chips and operating systems. What does this mean for long run? Well, the Korean semiconductor companies are arguing that they have no alternatives but to choose China due to their own country's limited domestic supplies, demands and all that. So, and then technologically advanced middle powers like the UK and Taiwan become critical portals for this being a restructured global value chain and new nodes of power and material exchanges. So this is really interesting in terms of how well we can mobilize our economies and create political consensus will have a critical effect on how we tap into this global competition and the way we're able to preserve our strategic autonomy in face of this great power politics. But the overall theme I think we're going to be seeing in the next few years is that secondary powers that have in the past pursued a hedging strategy between great powers, meaning avoiding choosing sides, you do a security deal with one, you do an economic deal with the other. It's not going to work unless you're a pivot player like India, or maybe Saudi Arabia, or maybe UK, that you have a certain leverage over the whole region as a possible leader. It's just not going to be effective, as the Americans are not going to let you do economic deals when they have a security alliance with you and they worry about spillover effects in technologies. In the past, we had neglected that there are underlying institutional support structures for these secondary powers to play these hedging games, and these structures are falling apart. So where, if I may conclude, just where we can make a difference, where we can assert collective leadership and cooperations are in new issue areas, such as digital currency. Right? China is rolling out these digital currency now, but it's not the kind of stable coins that we're talking about and the BIS is talking about. And this is important because they'll have long-term effects in the global south, capitalization, liquidity. In development, in projects, regionalization projects, how EU project extends to Baltics and elsewhere, and that will have a direct effect in terms of how we shape the regional architecture, as well as in the sort of reorganization of the workforce as we introduce digitalization and green technologies. This is where it's going to start, at home. So I guess we do still have leverages, and compared to at the start of 1900s, certainly, state capacity is very different, but the role of the secondary powers in being able to play leverage roles in the great power competition, I think remains something to be worked out, but something significant. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Casey. Thanks to all of our speakers. The questions are rolling in. That's great. Please do keep on sending them in. I'll probably start off with a couple of questions that begin where Casey's presentation left off. There was a mention of green technology there. And the question first off for Helen about the environment and the energy industry, and then perhaps one for Aisha about the realm of ideas and the environment, and the one from Hayden Belfield from the Center for the Study of Existential Risk to Helen. How will the clean or renewable energy transition affect US power? You mentioned the United States as a financial power, but also an energy power. How will the clean or renewable energy transition affect this, you think?
Well, I think that what's beginning to emerge is a really complicated and in one sense interesting, though fraught question about what the consequences are of the United States essentially under the Trump administration having asserted its power in a number of ways against China that has encouraged a rethink of certain energy questions in China. Now you can think about that in terms of energy security, but it's also clear that over the last couple of years that China has gone back to using more coal again. So that you have a basic argument that is now being deployed, particularly by some on the left in the US, who I think will hope that Joe Biden, if he is to become American president, will take this up, which says essentially you can't have a confrontation with China of the kind that's been going on since 2017 because it's too destructive in terms of China's energy policies. That essentially if China is so distrustful of the US that it retreats back into energy sources on which it has high domestic production, of which coal is obviously the heart, then that the planetary consequences, the climate consequences are too much. So there are some people, Adam Tooze is a good example of this, he's essentially arguing that détente with China is necessary for the climate crisis. And I think there is going to be pressure from if Biden is to be the US president, and obviously that is still quite an if, that is taken on board, and that in some sense that energy policy in the US and the use of American energy power is coupled back to the trade question. Having said that, I remain somewhat skeptical about the idea that any American president is really going to shy away from the amount of extra power that is effectively the United States has acquired over the last decade by the fact that it's become one of the three world's leading energy producers again. And it's very easy, like as President Obama did, to sort of talk the talk on climate. But if you look at what actually happened in American climate policies during the Obama presidency, it was essentially to use shale gas revolution in order to reduce the use of coal in the United States. So I think there is a genuine question as to how to deal with China in regard to energy and the desire, as I say, not to push China back towards energy autarky. Not that it can get rid of the use of of oil and gas in the short term or even in the medium term for that matter. But I don't quite see the argument that says we need to accommodate China about other things because we don't want it to use coal. To increase its use of coal is in the end going to prevail in the US.
Thanks very much, Helen. Again, an environmental question, this time in the realm of ideas. Aisha, you mentioned the idea of periodizing, drawing close to the 20th century in the realm of ideas, as well as geopolitics. We've got a question from Robin Brown, an SPS alumnus from Queens. who asks if the growth of a wider understanding of the climate crisis and a need for collective international effort, could that be a dividing point with the 20th century?
I mean, I think it could be. I'm not sure it lends itself necessarily to the kind of periodization that we like to use in our various historical schematics. But I think it is possible that we will say 20th century was characterized by a belief in modernism and progress understood in that way. Which often came at the expense of the environment and nature and so on. And then 21st century is a different one in that way, that something shifted in our relationship with the environment. I mean, I don't know that we would be able to say it, but maybe later generations may see that sort of difference. That's, I think, how I would answer the question.
Thanks. KC, there's a kind of a question. You mentioned middle powers beyond the kind of chimerical duality that Ferguson has put forward. And a question here about kind of those middle powers in connection with demography. So Chris Vermont, an SPS alumnus and chairman of BPL Holdings, asks, what will be the demographic impact over the next century? Will the demographic advantage of India, Nigeria, Indonesia make any difference, in your opinion, to the balance of power?
That's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I guess, I'm not a demographer, so it will be hard for me to project from the current data. But I mean, I would say that I will think it will make less of a difference than one might suggest. And the reason is technology. I think, the workforce is increasingly being deindustrialized and even moved away from service industry. And so what we could see potentially, and I don't want to subscribe to any kind of, sort of massive, automation kind of image of the world, but certainly a vast population will be turned into agricultural production or consumer and data gathering basis, rather than being able to be retrained for AI-enabled workplace. And this could very well overturn this long-held logic of developmental economics, the very core of how we understand development back in the middle of the 20th century. It's not going to work when these sort of, technologically enabled production kicks into place, start to take effect. But I mean, if I may, I want to second what Helen said just earlier about the environment and great power competition linkage. I mean, I think the problem is, of course, that there is no guarantee that by reaching a détente with China, that we're able to get the kind of commitment that the Chinese are promising for environmental cooperation. And we know from past so 5-year plans that China have failed to reach the very goal that it set for itself, and due to a myriad of reasons. It's very good at output of green technology because they're very good at industrial policy. You pump a lot of money into it and you take technology from abroad, so you can move very fast on that. But it doesn't mean China has become any greener. Furthermore, it's not a Chinese problem. If you look around, China is able to create a lot of coal-fired power plants in Pakistan and elsewhere, precisely because we don't have any solution for developing countries to leapfrog that. So that's something that's a broader issue. And it's not something that could be dealt with in bilateral relations with China and US. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Casey. I've got another question here for Aisha concerning one of the remarks from on China. And this is from Arena, a former MPhil student, I think indeed a former student of mine from 2018, who asks, Aisha, you said that China functions as a 20th century nation. What do you mean by this? And could you please expand on this point?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm not an expert on China, so this is more general observation, but I do think China seems to be much more of a nation state than even Western states are in terms of its territoriality, in terms of its treatment of minorities, in terms of central control. So, and I mean, I would say this not just about China, but about a number of states that were kind of formed or reshaped themselves in response to Western pressures from the West, and I don't think they've really left that behind it and have been less reflexive about that aspect of modernity than even a lot of Western states have been. So that's what I meant, that it still is very much a 20th century state. I don't see it developing kind of an alternative or a challenge to the Westphalian model. I guess it's another way of putting it. And I'm not saying it needs to, but if we're talking about a new order that's very different from, or a fundamental change from the order that we're in, we would, I suppose we would be looking for an actor that has alternative visions. And I just don't see that in China yet.
Thank you. This is a question for Professor Thompson. This comes from Rasmus Bertelsen, who asks, in connection with China and energy, how do you see the deepening Russian-Chinese energy relationship, focusing on the Russian Arctic and the Far East?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can see, really going back to the early years of the 21st century, and certainly in the aftermath of the Iraq War, you can already see, I think, the beginning of something like a China-Russia energy axis. And you can see the fact that the American engagement in Iraq militarily in 2003 kind of freaked the Chinese out in terms of making them see that perhaps the vulnerability that they had where energy security was concerned in the long term, and that there was an alternative for China in becoming too dependent on Middle Eastern oil itself and too dependent on oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, to start looking to Russia as a supply source. And that was even more so in relation to gas. And then later on, you get agreements made to build a pipeline, a Russian and Chinese gas pipeline. I mean, I think that, like, one way of looking at the energy predicament, if you like, if we just keep the climate out of it for the moment, would be to say that we've moved to a world in which there are three principal oil producers: the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, and that China has replaced the United States as the world's largest oil importer, and that two of those three principal energy powers, Russia and Saudi Arabia, are now competing over China. And that is quite a destabilizing, phenomenon, because in lots of ways, from the 1970s onwards, the linchpin of the energy world was the US-Saudi relationship, and that is not the same as it was. It can't be the same as it was, because the US isn't importing as much oil, and now there's this effective competition between the Saudis and Russia over China, at the very same time as they're having to deal with competition and the consequences of shale oil, at least they were before the pandemic, on oil prices. So I think that we are going to continue to see a fairly complementary energy relationship between Russia and China going forward, and it's going to continue, though, to have some destabilizing consequences in the Middle East, because Saudi Arabia is not simply going to say that, okay, to Russia, you can have the Chinese market where oil is concerned. It's not going to work like that. And I think if you say, okay, well, what's happened in the pandemic is, like, for the first time, it's not going to last, but for the first time, you had a little bit of cooperation between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia over oil prices, because otherwise they were all looking at catastrophe, like in March. But the basic situation of this energy dynamic between these three oil producers, plus China having become the world's largest oil consumer, is very destabilizing.
Could I add something to that? Thank you so much. So I think, Helen, you're absolutely right. And the interesting thing is I'll just offer a little sort of another layer to it, which is that the Sino-Russian energy relations is essentially a down payment for access on the Chinese part. Right? If you sort of look at the price that China is paying for that $500 billion deal with Russians, they're paying something like double the price of the current price of oil and gas going through the pipeline. It's not an economically efficient way of doing this. So you might say, well, this is about energy security, right? Of course, you can pay more as long as the source is secure. Well, how do we know the source is secure from the Russians, right? It's a first step for the Chinese toward a different kind of energy security. It's not just diversification, but ultimately what the Chinese want is a global network that transcends the US control of the SLOCs, the sea lanes of communications, Hormuz, the Malacca and all that. And Russian gas and oil is important, but ultimately it's about having the ability to say, well, I have many suppliers, not just Russians, the Iranians, the Saudis, Qataris, and all that could be done in a network of swaps and other mechanisms, which means that China is not dependent on any given ones. So the difference between US in the past as #1 consumer and China as the #1 consumer today is that the geopolitical implication of US was that it needed territorial control over resources in the 20th century. In the 21st century, it's not that. The Chinese operation will be market-based, and the former imperial powers in the Middle East wouldn't need, or don't need Saudi Arabia as much, whereas the new powers will seek to get around it. So I see a very bleak future for Saudi Arabia and other oil producers in the region, especially since their fisc is going down the drain with the low oil prices anyhow.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions for closer to home. Firstly, perhaps one for Aisha on Europe, and then I might go back to Casey and Helen, questions on the UK. And the question for Aisha is from Shahrukh Khan, a current MSc in International Relations student in the department. And the question is whether Europe will act as a middle power or a pivot power, and whether European countries will independently assess their position, particularly in relation to US-China relations.
Yes. Again, I mean, I don't work on European politics, so perhaps Helen is the better person to answer this question. But I do think there will be more flexibility in that regard than there has been previously as we go into this century. I mean, that's what I would say. I think. I mean, there was something that was settled, so that's been kind of shaken loose. What's going to come next, we don't know. It could be same old, same old. I mean, what the current situation we're in could last for decades, or something else, some new equilibrium may emerge. But it is a fact that there is at least perceived uncertainty. So I think all actors are kind of rethinking where they are standing and are more open to options than they were previously. I mean, I think that is especially true in the case of the UK because of Brexit, but I think it's generally true about Europe and all the other peripheral, especially peripheral actors of Europe in the East. So, thanks.
Thanks. Helen, I don't know if you want to have a go at either that same question, or there's a related question from David Carter, also an MST student in the department, who asked whether the United Kingdom will feature prominently in the quote unquote next century. So either or both, Europe as a pivot power and the UK in the 21st century.
I mean, I don't think that the UK is going to feature strongly in terms of any kind of exercise of, like substantial power. It's not in a position to, and it wouldn't be in a position to, even if it hadn't left the European Union. I think that what we can see, which I think goes back to what somebody, it might have been Aisha right at the beginning, said, is that the European countries individually and collectively via the European Union are in some difficulty because they are at risk, which is a fear that President Macron keeps, like articulating, that they're going to get squashed in a great power competition between the US and China. If we just look at it in, that realpolitik language for a moment, and we can see that the Trump administration has been willing to apply quite a lot of pressure on the European governments to try to push them, not necessarily to the American position on trade confrontation with China, but certainly to the American position on technological competition with China. And that's why the Huawei has been such a big issue. Now, if we take the UK on this, we can see, I think, that at the beginning of the year, then Boris Johnson was actually trying to say, okay, the UK can have a relatively independent policy on this from the US, and we don't going to get dragged into technological competition with China simply because it's the policy in Washington. But what we've seen during the course of the pandemic, in good part, I think, a consequence of the Hong Kong issue, but perhaps not entirely because of the Hong Kong issue, is actually that the American pressure on Britain has worked. And that, like Britain is not going to have Huawei in the 5G networks, and on China, that British policy is clearly moved in a more Atlantic direction. And we've not seen the same movement within the European Union. Now, if we then look at like what's been going on in the European Union, the crucial question is clearly Germany, because Germany's commercial relationships, the commercial relationships between the German economy and the Chinese economy are very different than they are for any other European country, and it would be a big shift, a very disruptive and destructive shift ultimately for the Germans to move their position. But what I think we're going to see for the European Union going forward is ever more Franco-German disagreement about this. Because if you listen to the way in which Macron's talking about European industrial sovereignty, he's clearly directing that language against China and against the United States. And that is not language in relation to China that Merkel's at all comfortable with. And then you've got to add in the fact that there's this pretty strong disagreement over how to deal not only with Russia, but how to deal with Turkey as well. So I would say is that in terms of the European Union, it's got really hard geopolitical choices to make about how to adjust to this new world. And yet there isn't really any basis of unity within the European Union, because the structural differences between France and Germany in this respect are deep and not going to go away.
Thank you, Helen. We've got one that follows on probably for KC, and this is from Hamish Falconer, a Yale World Fellow and former POLIS student. KC, could you say a little more about how you see the choices for the UK in relation to unstable power politics?
Absolutely. Thank you, Hamish. Well, I think, just build on Helen's point just now. I would say that UK in the past 40, 50 years has been sort of dovetailing what in our literature, Helen Milner and Edward Mansfield talked about, this sort of functionally driven institutionalization. So smaller countries band together so they can increase competitiveness and have a unitary voice to offset greater powers. And what we're seeing is, with decoupling and other things, is the sort of shift away from these territorially bound regionalism toward different things. So you see that across the board. It's not an EU problem. We see that in ASEAN. We see that in South, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization for Central Asia. In all these efforts, regionalism has fallen apart. So this will lead to a sort of different kinds of formation of transnational ties. And the question is how the UK can insert itself into these new networks. So for one thing, if you remember back in the sort of 60s, 70s, and early 80s, the UK had an enormous role to play with global finance. This is a time when we had Eurodollars, right? And we had these jumbo loans. The UK packaged the petrodollar and sold it to the global south, as loans, which then caused all sorts of problems down the line. But London was able to, sort of react in such a way. Well, today there's another opportunity, right? We see, Hong Kong being, in crisis. We see US shutting out Chinese money. There's a golden opportunity. I know it sounds completely loaded to use that term, to use London as another mechanism to move around, finances, global finance, investment, all that. Now, this just means one thing. Of course, there's a short-term benefit, but how does the UK then produce power, generate power out of that economic advantage? Well, this will have to do with whether we can introduce higher level regulations, ethical, sort of implementation of ethical capital and various other things that will enhance our position. And there's a need for that in the sense that China has always outsourced governance to other countries by joining WTO and other things. So it will be looking at a higher level governance institutions around the world. And this is where UK can do so for a lot of things, digital finance and various other things.
Thank you. I've got a question from Matthias Hammer for Aisha regarding the Before Defeat project. And the question, Matthias is a HSPS graduate currently at Oxford, who asks, what characteristics are linked with the decline of international orders? And to what extent are these characteristics present in our current moment?
Thank you. Hi, Matthias. You've left us for Oxford, but I will still answer your question. I have a very long answer to this in the form of my next book, but I've come to think that actually orders decline for structural reasons that don't have much to do with agency or what particular actors or states are doing. So one example would be, and I mean, I have a particular definition of structural, but I would put in that basket, climate change or monetary crises, things like that, that are sustained over long periods of time, cause the fragmentation of orders, decay of institutions, factionalism, and so on. So I would say many of those conditions are present now, but that doesn't mean, I mean, it's also a matter of, how long. So yes, I mean, I would think it is very much possible, that not only will this order will decline, and it's also possible that it's not going to be replaced by a newer, better version of itself, as that's been the case for a number of orders in recent memory, but there will be an actual fragmentation of order, more regionalization, and it will be a long time before we come up with another, or humanity comes up with another order, similarly international or global aspiration. So that is, I think, in the realm of possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got possibly time for one last question. Again for Aisha, there's Nicholas Chan from POLIS who asks what you think about the anti-science movements that have arisen in the West surrounding the pandemic, and what might this mean for the new international order, or a new international order, excuse me.
I mean, I guess that goes with what I was saying in terms of, in belief, erosion of belief in, modernity and progress, linear progress, and so on. So I don't think it's necessarily new. It's part of a bigger kind of trend. It would be inconceivable, I think, in the high point of 20th century for any politician to say, my opponent says he will listen to the scientists, vote against him. I don't know if you've seen, this was Trump's speech, but yeah, and it's actually global. It's not just one country. And yeah, I mean, there are, and you could find it in other aspects of life. And it just points to the need for, I mean, the fact that we don't have consensus about anything, including science, and we haven't replaced this belief in modernity that I mentioned with something else. It is just uncertainty and distrust about everything. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, it's slightly bleak note to leave the discussion on, the kind of uncertainty and distrust, but such may be the temper of the times. We are right out of time. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for calling in to listen, and thank people in the audience for the questions. I apologize we didn't have time to get through to all of them. To thank our three speakers, Professor Thompson, Dr. Zarakol, and Dr. Lin as well. To thank the Center for Geopolitics for setting this up. And just finally, to remind people again that this has been recorded and the recording will be posted on the website for the Centre for Geopolitics. Thank you very much and good evening.